Welcome everyone, and welcome to the first official video on our channel, on our YouTube channel on the brain. This is Brain 101. It's a video that will discuss the different layers of complexity of the brain. You see, the brain is often presented as a bunch of neurons, which is true. The brain is a bunch of neurons, but there's more to that. There are different layers of complexity to the brain, and that is what we will explore together in this video. So let's start by the basics. What is a neuron? Well, a neuron is simply a cell that is designed to transmit electrical signals, information, via its projection, which is called the axon. The axon is the so-called electric wire of your brain. Now you do have a bunch of neurons in your brain. You have between 85 to 120 billion neurons in your brain. Let's summarize that, and let's say we have 100 billion neurons on average in a brain. And you do understand that this changes. It changes over time as your life goes on. It changes between individuals, so it's only an average. Now, each of these 100 billion neurons will receive on average 10,000 projections from other neurons. That's quite a bit. So if you summarize that and scale it up at the level of the whole brain, you would have the average of 4 times to the 15 connections in your brains. So that's quite a bit. Now these connections between two neurons are what we call synapses. So the synapse is basically the device linking two neurons between their connections. And these devices are extraordinarily complex, and they release chemical compounds which we call neurotransmitters. Now, once again, neurotransmitters are different chemical compounds. There's a bunch of those guys, and their concentration and their expression will change between each of those 4 times to the 15 synapses, which add to the level of complexity. The neuron was discovered by a Spanish scientist called Santiago Ramón y Cajal at the beginning of the 20th century. It was actually described as a singular cell by this guy. And in doing so, he gave us what we call the neuronal doctrine, which is quite simply a doctrine that states that whenever we're going to understand the behavior of neurons and their connections, we're going to be able to understand the functioning of the brain. If that was so simple, because as you will see, there are additional layers to that. So the connectoma refers to the pattern of connections between all these neurons. That's all nice, but there's a huge problem in defining the connectoma in each individual. First, it's different. Each brain is different. Each brain has evolved based on its genetic as well as its exposition, and it changes over time. The connections are never the same in the brain of an individual, and it changes over his life, during the entire life. I like to say that there's never been an identical brain on the earth ever since Homo sapiens appeared, and there never will be. Each brain is different and changes over time. So whenever you try to model the brain, you need to take these changes over time as an additional variable in your model. The brain is extraordinarily complex, and it goes beyond that. There's a lot of neurons. There's tons of connections. Actually, if you look at all the axons in your brain, we would have each in our brain the equivalent of 160,000 to 180,000 kilometers of axons in our brain. Actually, the mass of our brain is mostly occupied by all these axons, all these connections. If it was only that, there are additional layers to the complexity of the brain. One additional layer has to do with what we call the glial cells. Now, glia in Greek means glue. Initially, these additional cells that we find in the brain were thought to be simply structural cells to give a kind of cohesive nature to the brain. And actually, these cells are responsible for the commonly known and wrong idea that you use only 10% of your brain. When they were discovered initially, they were considered to be 10 times more prevalent than the neurons in the brain. This number has been brought down back to a ratio of 3 to 1 or 1 to 1. So let's say they are equivalent in terms of in terms of number to neurons, but they're definitely not 10 times more prevalent than neurons. But that's not the only reason why the idea that you use only 10% of your brain doesn't make any sense. Because glial cells are also active participant in all your cognitive processing, your thought process. They are actively involved in that. So whenever you try to understand the function of the brain, you can't limit yourself to the neurons. You have to look into the function of glial cells as well. Glial cells are involved in the concentration of neurotransmitters. They are involved in the strength of the synapses. They are involved in the general function of the neurons. So there's no way you can model a brain only by looking at the neurons. You have to take into account these glial cells. So glial cells and neurons are always in crosstalk and they work together. And that's not all. There is another layer of complexity to that. There's another type of cells we find in the brain. It's all these cells forming the layer, the membrane of the blood vessels. So your brain, although it weighs only 3% of your whole body, actually consumes 20% of the whole circulation. So it's by far the organ that receives the most blood input compared to other organs. Now, these cells forming the wall of the blood vessels are extraordinarily complex, and they also are continuously in crosstalk with the neurons and the glial cells. So this never-ending discussion between the layer of the blood vessels, the glial cells, and the neurons is called the neurovascular unit. And it is an extremely sophisticated mechanism by which you can bring blood vessels preferentially to certain areas of your brain. Right now, I'm talking to you, and so the areas of my speech are more in use than the area I would mobilize if I were to go run outside. So these areas of my brain, because of the neurovascular unit mechanism and what we call the autoregulation, receive much more blood than my motor areas right now. And fortunately, this mechanism is present because there's no way the brain could function otherwise. And it allows the brain to be extremely economical in its way to consume energy. So whenever you think of the brain, you're going to think first of the neurons, but think as well of the glial cells and think of all these blood vessels you have in your brain. All these population of cells are always in constant dialogue. You have the equivalent of 650 kilometers of blood vessels in your brain. It doesn't make sense, right? But really it does, because you have 100 billions neurons in your brain, and each of these neurons receive a capillary or small blood vessels. So that's quite a bunch of blood vessels within your brain. There's another layer that needs to be discussed, and it has to do with the electrical activity of your brain. Now, we've been measuring the electrical activity at the surface of the brain for a while now. It's what we call EEG, or electroencephalograph. This has been used by the neurologists, by all the scientists looking at the function of the brain, and it allows to measure the activity of the cortex. That's fine, but there's also electrical activity within the depth of the brain, and this has been neglected for a while because of the technical nature of measuring this electrical activity. We didn't have the technology for it until recently, where we started to investigate these in-depth electrical waves. And what we found was really a hidden gem, hidden secret of electrical activity. So there's a lot going on within the brain, whether it be synchronized areas, but mostly desynchronized areas. This allows the traffic of information without interference. We know that these are controlled by deep structures within the brain, and it's a new area of investigation in the brain right now. So, if I summarize, the brain is a bunch of neurons interconnected together. These connections are changing during your whole life. At the level of this connection called the synapses, there are chemical compounds, which are called neurotransmitters, that are freed. These neurotransmitters are various. They are different in nature, and they changes over time as well. So this needs to be taken into account whenever we discuss the complexity of the brain. And besides, there are other types of cells in the brain. There are the so-called glial cells, which we already mentioned. I forgot to mention that these cells are also interesting, unfortunately, because they are the cells that will be involved in the production of primary brain tumors. And then there are all these cells making up the layer of the brain vessels in the brain. And these are also of a very high complexity, very sophisticated, producing what we call the neurovascular unit, which dispatch the blood flow to areas that are active in your brain. So thank you for listening, and see you next week. So that was it for this week. Thanks for listening to us. We have a lot of pleasure producing these videos on the brain, on neurosciences. It's a topic that we do like. We do enjoy the topic. And the goal is really to simplify matters for you guys. So I hope you enjoy that. You know that it also serves a good purpose in that we are linked to a foundation called COEUR en Tête, which actually support my lab. So my lab does research on brain tumors. We're looking for new treatment strategies. So everything that will be considered a profit on this channel will be sent to the laboratory. So if you like what we do, if you enjoy these videos, do not forget to like the channel, to like the videos, to subscribe, and to click the bell so that you get notifications whenever we get a new video out. Please leave comments as well as questions. If you guys have specific questions on the brain, on neurosciences, and we would be more than happy to respond, to address some of the questions you guys have on the brain. So thanks again for listening. Notice as well that there is a link directly to my internet site that will promote any media activities as well as release of new books. So thanks again for being there.